Good afternoon. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to this event on loss and damage and agri-food systems. Of course, loss and damage is high on people's minds and great momentum here at COP28 already. But today we're going to hone in on what does loss and damage mean specifically to agriculture? What does loss and damage mean specifically to food systems? And to really to set the tone for the event, I'm very much honored that we have the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Chu Dong-hu, to give the opening keynote speech. Director General, may I invite you up here, please?
Thank you, Kevin. And welcome all the friends. And it's timely to have this event together with all of your support. Phil, yesterday, we are so delighted to hear that the COP28 opened the historic agreement on the operationalized loss and damage fund. About the vulnerable countries deal with the impact of climate breakdown. That's is, we designed work together last COP with Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. So sometimes if we are determined, we can move fast, speed up. Because, the Paris Agreement that they found the $100 billion, it's almost 9 years, still not on the level we expected. But this one is after 1 year now with two host countries. With the technical support from FAO. That's why FAO, my colleagues, I'm really proud of them. Work together efficiently, effectively, and also we report the food loss and damage fund and the report, especially infected agri-food systems from the climate change. That's something I think also you can get all the report, yeah, on the FAO website. So and Thomas is here, so I don't want to speak too long, too much, but all of you knows what the meanings. The action should be come from the financial support on agricultural investment, and also we need a science and innovation. Loss and damage needed fixed by the innovative way. We couldn't return back to the before industrialization. Yeah, everyone want to dream back to the traditional farming. It's impossible. But we need to upgrade our farming systems, which produce more with less. How to produce more different, more quantity, high quality with less input and less negative impact on the environment. That's our real common mission. And FAO is ready to work with all of you and to protect the biodiversity and also make potential use of the biodiversity by different tools, traditional tools and modern technologies, biotechnologies, and others. And the second, also we need the responsible investment, not only on science innovation and also on the agro infrastructure. If you look at the agro infrastructure from the soil improvement to the road, the cold chain building, storage, post-harvest treatment, it's whole value chain should be covered. And that's reduced the food loss and the waste. If I think 4 years ago, I asked the chief economist to calculate what it means related to the gas emission and the environment impact. Each kilograms of the food we lost or wasted. It's a big impact on the environment. So I always encourage all of you at FAO now in the FAO cafeteria, we establish system to zero waste. I think during past years, now the waste in FAO cafeteria, it's dropped dramatically. So that's also is take each individual part. And last but not least, I think also reducing all the damage, which not only created by the climate change, also or mismanagement. I think this word we need a lot of sophisticated management. Management they have two basic ways. One is objective management. A lot of people, politicians talk about the objective management, but you don't have a critical process management. That's why we always have a no roadmap, no critical quality control of the management. I learned it from HSCCP. Each project, each initiative, we need HSCCP control, critical point to control. So that's the two measurement to the loss and damage, and then to really to improve the efficiency and the environment friendly at large, not only agrifood system and the social economic development at large. And I hope FL is your dependable professional partners and with different region, different partners, and we welcome all suggestions and recommendations from the academy, from private sector, from NGOs, of course, government, and the other international organizations, partners. That's why the hand in hand initiative. We want to work with all relevant partners together and create that international platform, which I can now is the World Food Forum. It's your forum. You can take the ownership, partnership to establish your own set events, and if you're willing to offer the necessary service or technical support. Because if we have so many different expertise on the different specific areas, and also networks. Through FAO, you can get a relevant and the highest first class of the expertise from different members, different institutions. That is the advantage. Financing, innovation, enabling policy. It's a real leader, the game changing. Thank you. I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Director General. So, and I know that you have other pressing engagements, but I think you've set the scene. Loss and damage. It's important. The financing piece is just one piece. The science is also critically important. The policy piece is equally important. And I know Professor Rockstrom and the other panelists are going to dig into not just what we know, but what we don't know and need to know to deal with loss and damage. But before that, we have my colleague Zatuni, who's going to take over and to present you a little bit with the outlines of the report that we are presenting today from FAO. That is, I guess, our starting point in this journey on loss and damage to make sure that whatever comes of loss and damage, the agriculture and food systems are in a way not left behind. So Zatuni, over to you for the presentation and the moderation.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Director General, and apologies he has to leave for another event. So it's my pleasure to take over and continue with the moderation. As it was said before, we're really excited where we are now with the loss and damage, and the fact that there's so many commitments yesterday from countries to put in money to make this fund operational and hopefully make a difference to people's lives. And what we're going to do in this session is to talk a little bit about some of the evidence that we all need to know about what does loss and damage really mean to food and agriculture, and what are the gaps, what are the opportunities really going forward. And it's my pleasure really to introduce our speakers who are going to tell us a little bit more about this topic. So before we move to the panel discussion, I'm really delighted that we have Professor Johan Rockstrom with us, who doesn't need any introduction. So we're really delighted that he's going to tell us a little bit more about this evidence and scientific evidence in relation to loss and damage. Rockstrom, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks you so much. And let me start by setting this whole topic of loss and damage in the food system in the context of the COP28. I would argue it's a really important agenda to make progress on, but perhaps not primarily at this juncture from the perspective that you would expect, because we come to Dubai recognizing that we are not making progress. We're moving towards 3 degrees Celsius, which is, from a loss and damage perspective, nothing less than a disastrous outcome. The price tag of a 3 degrees Celsius world, if we would factor in all loss and damage, would be basically infinite cost, because we would be talking about social collapse at the scale of billions of people in the world. But it's also, we're running out of carbon budget. So we meet here and need to be making significant progress on mitigation. And I mention this in the context of loss and damage because I would argue personally that loss and damage is so important, because by putting forward the evidence that nothing less than major financing is required, and a really science-based attribution capacity for loss and damage is needed urgently, becomes a constructive pressure why we need to make even more progress on mitigation. To put it a bit bluntly, if the price tag on loss and damage is really high, it gives more incentive to really make progress on decarbonizing the world economy, because it proves the point that it's costing very much socially and economically to not make progress on the mitigation agendas. I just want us to be clear that these are interconnected agendas. They're not separate. And that is really fundamental. Now, when we come to the core of the loss and damage, yes, there's a lot of progress being made in the negotiations and putting money on the table. I would argue, though, that we're still far away from the quantities of funding required. Nobody knows what those numbers are, but unfortunately, we're probably also, for people at the and high temperatures, are beyond acceptable levels for human health, which can even put life at threat, but also risk pushing people out of their communities, meaning migration, displacement, migration, potentially also conflicts. Now, the big question is, how do you value that in a loss and damage context? And quite honestly, we do not have the full methodologies for that. We've come a very long way in weather attribution of extremes. So you may have seen all the great work of the Weather Attribution Project. I would argue that's the furthest we've come in terms of linking extreme events that are immediately hitting food security with human caused global warming. That is one of the key entry points for costing loss and damage. But we need to come much further, because what we're discussing here is really the direct connection between global warming caused by human induced climate change and impacts on the food agenda. I would argue across the food value chain, but let's focus on farmers and farming communities and the production of food. Just making that attribution link still requires develop the methods for that fully. IPCC has summarized, and there's a lot of research out there showing indications of the magnitude of scale that we have already today, in the order of 5, varies between crops, varies between hydroclimatic zones, but we can see evidence of up to 5-6% yield reductions already. We see indications of small scale farmers in semi-arid regions in the world having even stopped to plant parts of the rainy seasons because of changes in onset of rainfall. All of this is major evidence for loss and damage calculations, but we don't have the full assessment methods in place, and we don't have the full attribution methodologies in place for those food system related impacts. At the Potsdam Institute, at my institute in Germany, we coordinate EasyMIP, which is the inputs to the IPCC on climate impact assessments, and we're working very hard together with FAO on developing these methodologies for impact assessments. So I'm just flagging here that science gives all the justification today for the need of loss and damage for food systems, but we still need a lot of work to be able to really perfect the methodologies and how to connect it to this challenging step of attribution to the responsibilities to compensate in a loss and damage scheme. Drawing a little line there, and let me just change tack to just share with you some of my thoughts, at least, which kind of adds to the complexity, but also to the importance of loss and damage, which is, what kind of impacts are we talking about when it comes to food systems or social systems in rural communities? Well, I would differentiate these in terms of direct impacts and deep impacts. And we tend to focus only on direct impacts, yield reductions, disease patterns, water scarcity, soil degradation, ecosystem changes, changes in production capacity of landscapes in agricultural regions. That is really good and fundamental to calculate loss and damage estimates. But we have more and more science indicating that you have also deep impacts, which are impacts that are really difficult to quantify economically, even socially. And I'll just give you one example from research that we have been leading, which is when climate change causes rainfall extremes, which in turn causes droughts and floods, which impacts on yields in agriculture. This causes, um, you know, abrupt impacts on particularly vulnerable households in rural regions, for example, in semi-arid regions in the world. In many cases, you then get periods of really, really difficult hardship for communities. So they tend to then change their fundamental household behavior. And one of the first steps is that they take their children out of school. So you end up in a situation where climate change causes water scarcity, causes food impacts, impacting on household economies, and children are not, uh, parents cannot afford to have their children in school. And then after that water extreme, when the households come back into food production again, they don't put their children back into school again. You get a permanent social implication in the households because of that hit that occurred in one time step, but you don't rise afterwards. And we're not mapping that. We're not mapping the cost for those families, nor for those economies of losing that capacity for the nation and for the communities. These deep impacts, I think, are also really important to start looking into the loss and damage assessments, displacements, schooling and education, gender equity, impacts in what happens with rural communities when you have climate change induced impacts. So I think this is just in a way scientifically to just share with you that this is not a straightforward agenda. It requires a lot of work, and we are, I would argue, in the scientific community, really ready to work much closer with FAO and other colleagues to move this forward so we can get an operational step on the whole loss and damage mechanism so that it can be applied, but don't underestimate the challenges. So over to and back to the panel to dwell on these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Johan Rockstrom. It's always a pleasure listening to you and giving you perspectives, on these important issues. And I really liked your point on the deep impacts. And it's true, we tend to focus on the impacts we're familiar with, the direct impacts, but there are deeper implications of climate change and the linkages you made between water scarcity impacting on food and household livelihoods and impacts, and then on education and on children. And I think this is the connection in the real world that we need to pay more attention to rather than looking at things in isolation. So thank you very much for highlighting that, and also highlighting the fact that we're far away from the quantities of finance that we need really to tackle the climate crisis. I think the commitments yesterday on loss and damage, they're really very encouraging, particularly on the first day of the COP. We still have a long way really to go to mobilize sufficient funds to deal with all these challenges. Um, and also the cost of not making enough progress on mitigation. I think that's something that we all have to be aware of. We left it so late now that we have no choice but to adapt, but we still have to make deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We need to really raise our ambition and action. So thank you very much for that. And you highlighted a few points in relation to the loss and damage issues. And what I'm going to show in the presentation here on the report we're launching today on loss and damage in relation to food and agri-food systems in general. And one I want to share with you in a couple of slides here is is some of the important issues in relation to gaps and what we need to take into account going forward, and the implication for the operation of this fund, the loss and damage fund. So if I may have the slides on the screen and take you through some of the key findings of the report. Yes, yep. You can come at the edge here. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just go through some of the key slides that hopefully will help us for the discussion with the panels, and also for colleagues joining us. Please feel free if you have some comments to add, some points you would like to share with us, or some questions you want to ask. So again, this report is available online, and what we're trying to really find out is, the key issues related to loss and damage in agri-food systems, which are part of the solution to the climate crisis. Um, some key points here with regard to the fact that there is really clear linkages between agri-food systems and the climate change, and I think you heard this earlier. I won't go into detail about that, and the fact that the loss and damage are referring to this negative impact that you heard about. And in terms of what we know with regard to loss and damage in agri-food systems, well, not much really. That's why there is still a big gap in relation to, for instance, data. We don't have enough data that enables us actually to understand how loss and damage is affecting agriculture. Um, and we do have some economic evaluations, and you can see there the $3.6 trillion, and the fact that this is affecting the sector and the people who are employed in this sector, 866 million people. But also looking at the general data, you can see there on average we have around 123 billion per year that actually are quantified as corresponding to this average loss cost because of the loss and damage. And again, the people who are most suffering from this are the vulnerable communities and farmers, particularly smallholder farmers. In terms of relevance, it's really good that we do now talk more about the loss and damage, and there is financial commitment to move this agenda forward. And in terms of what countries are doing about this, if you look at their national commitments, NDCs in particular, well, above the third of the global NDCs now explicitly talk about loss and damage. And around the third again of this percentage, they talk about agriculture as being an important aspect of that. And for those countries who are referring to loss and damage, agriculture is obviously one of the most impacted sector, and we know that agriculture is the most affected sector by climate change, particularly when it comes to drought. And if we move on to areas where we need to pay more attention to, that helps us actually to mobilize, more resources and implement the fund, we need to have more clarity about what we mean with loss and damage in the context of agri-food systems. And as the Professor Rockstrom mentioned also, we don't have really enough methodologies that can help us to quantify this loss and damage and have a proper assessment of what it means for agri-food systems. And that in turns can help inform policy, can help deploy the relevant technologies and best practices that can reduce the vulnerability of agri-food systems. And of course, the last point is financing. I think you heard that earlier, that we don't have enough financing really to deal with the issue, and also enough capacity in the countries to deal with the data collection, analysis, and deal with the whole issue going forward, and interconnection with other areas. So in terms of finance, again, I won't dwell on this, but the point to take from this is that there's very little finance go into agri-food systems. You can see there around 4%. And when we consider smallholder farmers, it's around 0.3% actually of the whole climate finance that goes to smallholder farmers. A huge gap there going forward, not just in the context of loss and damage, but beyond. So these are some of the issues we need to look at moving forward with the loss and damage in agri-food systems. So I mentioned, the data, also to have the methodology to be able to assess the risk much better, invest in this data collection and research, and also to link up obviously with the adaptation and investment in adaptation. Other points there I can see in terms of dealing with the recovery, and being able to strengthen our way of responding to this emergency, having emergency response capabilities. So the main point you can see there in the conclusion going forward is to be able also to identify what are the vulnerable elements in the agri-food systems in each country, in each location. So I hope this takes a tour of some of the key findings of the report. Again, it's online if you want to look at the detail. And I hope this sets the scene also and picks up on what Professor Rockstrom also mentioned in his speech. Um, Now we have two panelists with us. Unfortunately, the minister from Pakistan is unable to join us. So I'm just going to join the two panelists there, so make it a bit cozy, and then invite you to answer some of the questions, and then we'll have concluding remarks afterward. Professor, feel free to join us. Perhaps there will be some questions, some points you would like to add. That would be much appreciated. Thank you. All right. Thank you. It's on now. So let me start with the youth representative, which is an important agenda in understanding, from your perspective, Sarah Hansen. You're the Youth Indigenous People First Nation representative from Canada. So thank you for joining us. And I just want to ask you first of all, what does loss and damage, mean to you, to the youth, community? If you could just give an introduction on that and your perspective to start with, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, for sure. So Bojani, um, I think loss and damages to Indigenous youth um, are compounded by a lot of other crises we face globally. Indigenous youth are some of the strongest policy makers and climate advocates globally. Indigenous peoples ourselves protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, despite only representing less than 5% of the world's population. And the fact that, especially in Canada, communities can't access the loss and damage fund because we're from a developed nation is an issue for us because Indigenous peoples in Canada face some of the worst climate impacts. We have Indigenous communities from the south right until the border of the states, even through the border of the states, all the way up to the Arctic. And to diminish us because we come from a developed nation is terrible because there's been communities on water boil advisories for years. There's been communities who don't have access to food systems, whose communities' land have been taken to them because of the colonization of Canada, who can't actually farm because we don't live on arable land, whose communities have actually been forcibly relocated to the north in the Arctic. And these issues compound into housing crisis, into health crises, into education crises, into the fear that we won't live anymore. And it's actually impacted us so much that Nunavut has the highest rate of suicide because of the youth. And these issues in the loss and damage fund, they don't allow us to access it. And it's important that we do because we are facing the worst of climate change. We are on the front lines. We're also being impacted by continued extraction. Um, and we're literally the ones whose communities are being asked to store nuclear energy and all of these other things that are created by climate change and that are needed for even this green energy transition. I can even speak to that is the idea of windmills and green energy transition. It's impacting caribou in Norway and in Sami regions. And these new solutions aren't actually solutions. So yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. How do you feel about the commitment that were made yesterday, the financial commitment from many countries, including United Arab Emirates and Germany and others, in putting so many money in the loss and damage fund?
I think commitments are just that, commitments. I think until it becomes a reality and we see that those funds, it's not going to be true. A lot of people over the years in a lot of countries have made commitments and haven't followed through on them. Canada itself continues to make commitments to Indigenous peoples, but continues to falter on those commitments and continues to make excuses. Like I said, Indigenous peoples in the global north can't access the loss and damage fund because of the World Bank's policies for providing it to least developed nations or um, area like those terms that um, policymakers here have agreed upon without our approval, without our consent. It's really important for this loss and damage fund for Indigenous peoples that we are able to access it, and not only in small funds or small grants, but in large funds and in large grants, because we, again, are the ones facing it the worst. We've been facing it the worst. You know, climate change has only become popularized in the last 15 to 30 years, but Indigenous peoples have been facing the impacts of climate change since colonization first started. When colonization first started, when colonizers came to North America, there was actually a global cooling period, and that was because of all of the Indigenous peoples they killed. This isn't something we're just facing now. It's been here since the first colonizers on the land, and it's going to continue being there until Indigenous peoples are the one leading these solutions and leading how the loss and damage fund is allocated, and we're part of the table.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Mizan Khan, I haven't introduced you yet, and I would like to invite you later on to give some concluding remarks. Dr. Khan, he's the Deputy Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development. Can you just give your thought on what you heard so far, what we presented, just your perspective on loss and damage?
Yeah, we have discussed quite a number of things related to loss and damage, but one issue I think not touched upon yet. It is about loss and damage related to slow onset events. Because in loss and damage, we have two types of impacts: rapid onset events, which figure in BBC News, Al Jazeera, and so there is a global sympathy always, and there is relief and rehabilitation. But research showed that over time, low onset events like salinity intrusion, land degradation, drought, etc., cause more loss of lives and also economic loss. And as Professor Aksham, you have mentioned, as economy starts growing, then together with direct impacts, deep, deeper indirect impacts even become something more prominent because the whole chain is affected. So I think we need to kind of develop a comprehensive approach to understanding loss and damage. And this is recognized that in developing countries, particularly in the low-income countries, agriculture and water sector are the most impacted. Yeah. Um, uh, in Bangladesh, for example, though the share of agriculture in GDP has gone down about 30%, 13% only. But still, almost 40% of people, directly or indirectly, depend on agriculture sector. So, GDP share is not the indicator of looking at the importance of agriculture. In African countries, agriculture kind of fares the overwhelming share of their GDP, for example, primary commodities, including primary commodities. So we need. Uh, I'm a long time private finance negotiator, so I'm not very optimistic. This few million, $100 million, almost $300 million, you know, committed. But how many impacted countries? How many billions of population? So if we think that just this 300 million is something big progress, I'm not accepting that. $100 billion floated back in 29, and now if we adjust inflation over this 13, 14, what is left of uh, kind of $100 billion? And the main serious problem is we have an yawning gap, and the gap is increasing between science and policy. IPCC science is getting finer and finer with every assessment reports, but national and international policy going down and down. So we are having kind of an inverse relationship between science and policy, and this needs to be bridged. And mitigation, we argue always, is the ultimate form of adaptation. If mitigation is not done, this tinkering with this little funding just to backpat the developing countries, I am not very happy about. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I will come back to the audience if anyone would like to make a comment or question. So please feel free to join us. Yes, sir, in terms of countries benefiting from this loss and damage fund, and so what do countries need to do to prepare the benefits from this, to prepare for better dealing with loss and damage, not just from the scientific point of view, but beyond that. It'd be good to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and before coming to that, let me just really strongly support your assessment here of indigenous communities being at the front line. We know that global warming is occurring almost 3 times faster in the Arctic region than at the planet as a whole. So Inuits, Sami, all the communities, the roughly 4 million indigenous communities living in the Arctic area is really at the front line of change. And this is really deep impact. It's not quantified in any way, the fact that reindeer herders and caribou herders are kind of slowly but gradually losing their grazing areas. They're having to have this, artificial feed currently for these ruminants that are hit by new disease patterns never seen before because they eat larvae and now they suddenly have to eat concentrated tears instead and they cannot cope with it. And they're just doing everything they can to adapt, but it's not seen anywhere, it's not measured anywhere. So I think to your question, what we need to do for receiving countries of loss and damage is to really go out and interview and talk to all the impacted people and really document the stories. You have to talk to the people. We have so much evidence now from veterinarians working in the Arctic region of the devastating impacts on indigenous communities. I'm sorry to say, but the indigenous communities themselves are not so vocal, or rather, they're not given the space in the public space to be heard. And we need to quantify, map, document, prove, point out the evidence. And this has to happen across the board. I mean, I'm really nervous by the fact that small scale farmers in the world, if you talk to them, they're so impacted by climate change, but talk to them about 1.5, and who knows what you're talking about? I mean, who knows really what's happening and that we are causing it? I mean, they see all the changes and they're kind of adapting to it, but they're more like social social victims to something that they've not caused and they're not able to express it. We need to basically help in that documentation to put for it's almost like a litigation light version.
That was great. Thank you. Does anyone have any question, any comments? We have a person here. So the mic, please.
Mics. I have to use their mics. Yeah, hi. I'm Rudula from India. I'm an architect specialized in sustainable development, and I work with rural communities, agriculture communities in India from now. Working with them, we see that the practices that have been built up over years, for over generations, the local practices has been lost. One, because of development of huge dams, and this also have led to displacement of the people, majorly indigenous people and marginalized communities. And in the name of irrigation, it is built, and there are alternative proposals that has been put up, say, so building smaller barrages instead of bigger dam in one place, but then in different intervals in the same banks, having smaller dams basically, and with the sustainable systems. So the question is there a way that we can really stop, I mean, at least think about stopping the development of one space and displacing the people majorly, and then going forward with the larger development for themselves?
Thank you very much. So we have to share this microphone. Is there anybody else who want to make a comment or question? Can see more? Is the lady at the back there?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this intervention. My name is Azra Saeed. I'm from Pakistan and I work with small and landless farmers across my country. And last year floods really were, we worked directly inside the communities which were awash. And this was the second time it has happened from 2010 to 2022. So when you talk about especially the direct impact and the deep impacts, we've seen it very clearly because within a matter of 12 years, it was a second uh, truly devastating. When you people talk about measuring and finding out and all of that, in the long run, we who are in the communities and we are not directly affected, being urban people, rural people can never go back. And how does the calculation, the working out, the measurements by academics and scientists very far from this, very, very far. I really feel there is no connect. Um, how do we bridge that gap? And why are the policymakers sitting in the north? And why are the policymakers not in the south from the rural communities themselves? What just to say, this year or last year when there were floods, it was cotton picking season, and women are the major cotton pickers across South Asia. Many of us can vouch for that. Now, when there was water standing and the water was not receding, these women were going in deep into the water and picking cotton. That water was yellow, and when they were coming out, their feet till here were thick with these pus-oriented boils. You know, they were just handicapped. They had no money to go even look after themselves, but they were going in to pick the cotton. They had nothing to eat. And this one, the point I'm trying to make is this yellow water was the drip from the industrial sector, and the water was coming right up from the north to the south. And it's not the industrial polluted water along with the rainwater. How do we measure that? How do we find something, find some way to take away the misery, the pain, and the total incapacity of those women to go back? Thank you so much. Thank you.
If you can be short, I can take more speakers. Otherwise, one more comment and that's it. Okay? So please be short.
Thank you. My name is Karin Joel. I'm a Tanzanian climate innovator, and my question goes straight to Professor Johan. We met briefly last year and spoke a bit about data work. And in advancement of my work for the past 1 year, I'd like to pick your mind on data harmonization. And we see international organizations and other bodies working on formal data collection sources. And we also see on the other side informal data collection sources coming in and advancements being made by young innovators, by other smaller groups and organizations, and seeing priorities on the loss and damage financing and better resource mobilization. How do you see merging these two data collection sources looking like?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Okay, well, thank you. If you have time, we'll come back. I'd like the panelists to react to these very good points that were made. And Professor, in your intervention, you also mentioned that we need to get some stories. We need to talk to the people and see what's happening in reality. And I think there was a good example there of how some communities are being affected by loss and damage. So I'll start with you to react to some of the points that were made. And then I'll go to Sarah, and then I'll finish with you, Doctor. So over to you.
Thanks. No, I mean, this is I think this just verifies my point, as you say, just about the need to anchor this locally. And I would say, even though there's no doubt that there's a disconnect today, but I do feel though that the whole loss and damage and the adaptation agenda, the resilience agenda at large, we've come a long way in actually engaging with stakeholders on the ground. So I don't think it's really a full disconnect, but it can be improved for sure. But one challenge that we have to recognize is that let's not let's not load everything in the loss and damage bucket, so to say. When you have local communities hit by disaster, they should be compensated and supported through existing institutions and management systems on the ground. And if they don't exist, that's a problem. But what we're talking about here is really quite advanced. Actually, we're going to prove that one party is cause for a climate-induced impact which has a cost that we need to compensate for. It's very specific, and they can only be done, I would argue, for really extreme events to start with, because it's already very complicated, and it will be still very difficult, as you know, to really get that attribution mapped out properly, and to get this funding to really start flowing. So don't let's just not underestimate the challenge. So, and it requires data harmonization and linking the scales, because you have to map locally but connected globally. The climate change is caused on the other side of the planet, causing impacts in a local community many continents away, and we have to prove the connection. That's what is at stake here, and I think we can do it. I know we can do it, but it requires some resources, and it requires really the data harmonization and the connection across scales. So we need FAO here for sure.
Sure. Thank you. What's yours, Sarah?
Hello? Yeah. I think that in terms of similar to how the farmers are feeling, indigenous peoples globally have not been part of this discussion about what loss and damage needs to look like. We're not stakeholders, we're rights holders. And I believe all of the UN nations have actually signed on to the UN declarations on the rights of indigenous peoples. And that's something that's still not recognized. And in not only the loss and damage policies being discussed here, but all of the policies that the conference is negotiating on. The rights of indigenous peoples are separate and distinct from even local communities, and we can't be lumped into something that doesn't represent us. And we can't be part of this loss and damage fund because it doesn't recognize that. In the documents that we've seen, we've been diminished to small grants, and that's not okay. Like I said before, Indigenous peoples have been feeling the loss and damage of climate change since colonization, and it's the states and parties that continue to not recognize that and to diminish us and to not hear us when we're talking. We need to be part of the decision making table of how that loss and damage fund is allocated because we are rights holders, unlike party members. They do not have any rights to the land because they are the ones destroying it.
Uh, First, in some points, I will mention some takeaways from this discussion. For example, as Professor, you have mentioned about the attribution science. So attribution science already progressing, developing, but we need to generate database, evidence base, as the Pakistani madam has mentioned. Only evidence-based generation of evidence-based can strengthen attribution science. IPCC reports are establishing general causation because every country bets that. But a specific causation is needed to improve our claims on loss and damage. This is one thing. Because general causation doesn't do. Then second point is we need to translate data into understandable language by the smallholder farmers. For example, meteorology, declares some kind of information, or the meteorology department gives some information. So the general people, we need to develop the climate information services so that what is the impact of these changes in weather, for example, impacts their life directly, their livelihood, their agriculture system, because they have a small farming system. So we need to improve the climate information services from the top down to the common people. And then we need, before financing, what I argue for is capacity building, both at individual and institutional level. And then only finance can help. Finance will not do if we don't have the minimum level of capacity, we don't have the minimum level of data generated. So these are the issues. FAO has been an organization, veteran organization for the last 75 years, as I understand. They have been doing a lot of good things, but the scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge based on action research needs to be bridged. This is something that, because local community farmers and the individual farmers also have lots of wisdom, which scientists don't understand. So this needs to be bridged. Local indigenous knowledge of farming and the scientific latest knowledge that if you can provide through your technical support programs. Okay.
Great. No, thank you very much. And I hope you found this discussion interesting. We covered so much in just short time, and I hope it was very useful. There's so many issues there to do with the financing and the data and linking science to policy. But I think more importantly, everything we're doing in this space, if it doesn't reach people and improves people's lives, then it's not enough just to talk about policies and commitments. So this is really a start of this loss and damage agenda in hopefully being concrete and reaching people. So thank you very much for joining us, and please join me to thank the panelists and thank everyone. Thank you.